When you hear the word woman, what do you think of? This is a genuine question. It's not meant to criticize, nor is it a trap. I want you to think of exactly what comes to mind. Every feeling, every thought, every item you associate with the word. And once you have that, I want you to consider where those associations came from. Do you think we, as humans, innately understand what is womanly and feminine, words we created? Or do you think, like me, that we have been fed a certain concept? Not only from brands and government who seek profit from categorization, but by the media we consume, even that which seems meaningless or even harmless. This is a weird example, but hear me out, okay? Plants vs Zombies. Specifically, Plants vs Zombies Garden Warfare 2. Look at the masculine plants, citron, corn, pea shooter. Then look at the feminine plants, rose and sunflower. Both supporting roles, the sunflower historically so, and both visually a feminine stereotype. A ditzy blonde and a femme fatale, somehow encapsulated through plants. Yes, it's true. Plants vs Zombies is upholding gender stereotypes.
Oh, no.
But most pieces of media do. Look at Terraria, look at any classic movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm not saying this in shock and horror, by the way. It's simply a fact, and I don't expect most content to include sociological discussion, especially not Plants vs Zombies. I simply think it's worth considering, and of course there are exceptions. For example, Arcane's take on League characters, or like Saga from Alan Wake 2. But both of those examples, and any you can think of, came with heavy backlash and even hatred due to their portrayal of women. Point is, femininity has been historically presented as dainty, unintellectual, weak, floral, and paradoxically, both virginal and seductive. There are so many layers to feminine performance, and despite the progress we see today in the breaking down of harmful stereotypes, most people still get an odd discomfort from a powerful, authoritative yet female individual. And the idea of what femininity should be has been hammered so thoroughly into our brains that it even dictates what our plant monsters will look like. Yes, I really am digging this deep into a children's game about plants and zombies. Leave if you can't handle this level of intellectualism. But anyway, when a game explores the history of gender roles without adhering to them blindly, I find that meaningful and worth discussing. We've already covered Bloodborne on the channel and how it explores gender as a whole, but today I want to turn to Dark Souls 2 and examine how femininity is shown through the 4 queens, how their characters don't fully adhere to the strict expectations and stereotypes of womanhood, and how they are equal to or more powerful than their male counterparts despite the patriarchal framework within the games. This video will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we're going to take a look at gender as a whole in the realm of Dark Souls. Then we'll cover Nashandra and Alsanna in their own sections, and combine Elana and Nadalia into one section. So remember to subscribe, join the Discord, check out the Twitch, and let's start before the comments get too angry. Let's begin with the scariest word of all. Patriarchy. I had a very interesting discussion on the Discord with a beloved member on the topic of patriarchy in the realms of Dark Souls. If you don't know, at the most basic level, patriarchy is a mode of society where men have the power. The world is built to enable that, and women are generally excluded from these powerful spaces. I'm not here to give you an hour-long historical breakdown if you want to learn more, but you have to generally understand the concept to engage with the coming discussion. Under patriarchy, women have strict expectations that are ever-changing and always dictated by the men in power. Of course, men have struggles as well and have certain harmful expectations forced upon them, but at a societal level, they will have an easier time maneuvering a world built by them and for them. So, the question is, does this mode of society apply to Lordran, Drangleic, and Lothric? Unfortunately, I can't conduct any kind of deep sociological study to figure out the finer details of this because I don't live in any of those nations, but we can examine the games themselves and make some conclusions. Great attention is brought to the kings in this series as the leaders of their respective nations. Gwyn and Vendrick are the biggest influences here, and Gwyn is basically God in Dark Souls, so he is the patriarch. It's also worth saying that very little attention is brought to Gwyn's queens or partners, thus suggesting that the role of king is, indeed, the more societally important role in royalty. The queens are very present in the second game, but on a surface level glance, they appear to occupy the companion role to the king, which would be expected by patriarchy. Let's also take a look at Guinevere and Gwyn's other daughter, Filianor. By the time we arrive in Anor Londo, the Guinevere we see is an illusion made by her brother Gwyndolin. The question is, though, why couldn't Gwyndolin meet us and give us the Lord Vessel himself? because the princess in the tower who needs our help is a much more appealing vision under patriarchy than the lone, forgotten, and hardly masculine royal holding down the fort. In her actual story, it seems she went on to mother many children in another land, as would be expected by a queen or goddess, so she fits the traditional role very overtly. His other daughter, who we meet in the Ringed City, fits these expectations too. She was given away as a gift by Gwyn, matching the reality of arranged marriage that princesses faced in our societies. But as he trapped the pygmy lords in the city using her, she was also trapped. She's known nothing else but servitude in her long life. She needs a royal guard, and when you interrupt her sleep, she can do nothing but stare blankly at the world she's woken up to. A starkly different presentation to Gwyn's other forgotten child, the Nameless King, presumed god of war. Like Guinevere, then, she fits these traditional feminine expectations. We also have Rosaria in Dark Souls 3, a presumed descendant of Guinevere's, chained, imprisoned, and used by Aldrich. Her prison is crowded by cribs, and she doesn't even have the ability to speak. It has been deemed that motherhood is all this woman of holy lineage is good for. It's a very horrifying depiction of tradition, but one that is indeed grounded in reality, especially a reality based in a medieval setting. And as a final point of evidence, I present the Firekeepers, who are all women. Their role is to serve the undead, tend the flame, and embody the typical feminine caretaker role. They are typically blinded and sometimes unable to speak. Their role is their entire purpose. This extends also to the Milfinito in the second game, who know nothing but song, and to Irene in Dark Souls 3, who sees herself as useless and only capable of servitude, also with her own male guardian. These women were chosen and stuffed into these stereotypical roles with no choice of their own, as would be expected in a patriarchal society. And despite patriarchy pretending to value this role, we see from the pile of Firekeepers in Dark Souls 3 that the reality is much like our own. They are completely disposable. So I'd say from this we can conclude that the realms of Dark Souls are generally held under patriarchy. However, I would argue that it is a looser form than the one we have existed under over history, especially the Middle Ages, which Dark Souls is set in. The Witches of Izalith worked directly with Gwyn and were powerful in their own right. Their tragedy was due to their own hubris, not due to any form of patriarchy. However, the real differences come when we look at the life of the typical undead. Regardless of your character's gender, you will be accepted as Lord with no differentiation. There's no voice lines that consider your gender like there are in Bloodborne, and the vast majority of armor sets have no difference. In fact, that concept has been completely eradicated by the time we get to the crumbling world of Dark Souls 3. There are also plenty of female knights who are accepted. For example, Lucatiel, the Dark Moon Knightess who breaks the feminine Firekeeper pattern, and Henri depending on your character's sex. The working class woman in our world would have to take on masculine roles in order to survive, but they're still expected to conform to femininity, particularly through constricting items of clothing like the corset or our modern day heel. No such expectation is seen by the armour that these female knights wear. Interestingly enough, there is also a level of gender fluidity that's accepted even in royalty. I'd mentioned the coffin in Dark Souls 2, but I honestly don't even know why it's a thing or if it's canon, so someone please enlighten me in the comments. And regarding the second game's queens themselves, they, as shards of Manus, blur the gender lines via their conception. It seems, then, that Dark Souls generally does reflect our real-world patriarchy, but the rules do appear looser, particularly for the average knight. If you're still with me, well, congratulations, and let's move on to the real meat of this essay, the queens of Dark Souls 2 and how gender is explored through them. Instead of tightly fitting the patriarchal expectations of supportive and weak royal, the queens are instead powerful and reflective of humanity itself. Despite the games existing inside of this patriarchal system, great effort is put into defying that system and its expectations through the characters. As the game says itself, gender has no bearing on ability. We'll of course begin with Nashandra, as she is the main antagonist of the game and the queen that we know the most about. Let's first cover her appearance, then her personality and actions, and see how it all adds up. To begin, let's establish the general lore for anyone out of the loop. The four queens, Nashandra, Alsanna, Nadalia, and Elana, are all shards of Manus, and each of them embody an aspect of his person. They were born from shards of his scattered soul, and thusly their nature is entirely of the dark. Nashandra embodies Manus' want, and she wants power, which is how she ends up the Queen of Drangleic. Now let's start some actual analysis, because I'm pretty sure that's the reason why you guys are here, so yeah. Feminine performance, or as Judith Butler named it generally, gender performativity, is a complicated and constantly shifting expectation for women in particular. In order to fit the mold that is expected of you, you need to think about your hair, your clothes, your figure, your skin, your personality even. This mold is ever-changing with this trend or that trend, but if you don't want weird looks or limited opportunities, you have to force yourself into it. Nashandra and the rest of the queens are a great representation of this concept, because she adheres to the performance. To her kingdom, she presents a regal woman dressed in a gown with perfect skin and hair, with royal tone and manners. She knew that in order to get to this position of power, to achieve her wants, she had to play the role of aristocratic and beautiful wife. Her true form, like her sisters, has little in common with the image she presents. The silhouette remains vaguely similar with a dress-like body, but there is no feminine and appealing aspects besides that. She did live in the society and accept the veneer, so I think it's understandable that there are some feminine traits that pass over to her actual body. For women do internalize these expectations, and as a personal anecdote, I don't even like dresses, but I find myself browsing over them whilst thrifting as if to present the idea of womanhood. This is what I should be looking at. This is what I should look like. Thus, I don't think her having aspects of patriarchal womanhood in her actual form goes against what I'm saying. You could interpret this design as stating these traits are inherent to womanhood, but as I said, I interpret it as a representation of how we internalize these expectations and they become a part of us. But still, Nashandra's true form does not adhere strictly to the performance that her fake form does. She appears demonic in nature, skeletal, tall, and inhuman. Her strength is entirely evident. In fact, her design is clearly based off the traditional look of the Grim Reaper. She embodies the antithesis of woman the life-giver, the invaluable fruiting womb, and instead she is death incarnate. So from her appearance alone, we can see that she doesn't adhere to the typical expectation of women, which is dainty, submissive, and secondary to men. Despite the world of Dark Souls existing under a patriarchy, the games make great effort to show that the expectations that come with it are unnecessarily limiting. This was obviously explored most overtly in Bloodborne, as I covered in this video, but we still see it in Dark Souls, and Nashandra is a good example. A woman may appear to fit neatly into the box expected of her, but underneath that veneer of femininity is a person much more complicated than society expects her to be. She is just as powerful as her king, arguably more so, as instead of simply putting her down, he built up defences to keep her away from the flame, and then receded into the undead crypt. Ambition has an interesting relationship with femininity, and by that I mean it has no relationship at all. To be ambitious in everything you do as a woman, to desire power, money, and fame, goes against tradition. By wanting, you are stepping past the bounds of gentle submission and taking your desires into your own hands, opening the doors for yourself instead of waiting for a man to do so. And Nashandra is ambition embodied. She aims for the highest power in the land, the first flame, and yet she knows she can't reach for it when presenting a visceral form such as this. The highest ambition a woman should desire is motherhood, not the flame that fuels the world. This feminine performance, then, was a necessary step in order for her plans to work. Instead of facing Vendrick and the giants head-on and battling an entire nation to reach that power, she used intelligence and cunning, more unwomanly emotions, to plant herself within government and influence everything behind the scenes. Her veneer of femininity is overall discarded once she has her final fight with you. Her plans and ambitions stopped only by yours. She shows us that a dark and intimidating appearance is not only for kings and strong men, but for women too. There should be no expectation of dainty femininity and polite smiles for a woman this powerful, and her true form shows us that such things are a false reality placed upon us. In order to please Vendrick, to please the kingdom, she must look like a traditional queen, but when fighting for her actual goals, her wants and her desires, she has no need to look pleasing and unintimidating. Women may internalize aspects of what is expected of them, but their natural state is not a polite companion with no power of her own. There isn't a framework that all women adhere to despite what we've been told. They're capable of violence and desire. They are just as varied as men can be, just as varied as humanity can be, and we see this through Nashandra and Alsanna especially, who we'll move on to later. Now, let's delve deeper into Nashandra's actions and how gender expectations are explored through those too. As we've covered, she wants power, but she wasn't satiated by becoming queen. She convinced Vendrick to cross the sea and wage war on the giants, for they had a treasure she wanted, and one her king returned with. This, of course, had devastating effects on Drang Lake as a whole because the giants didn't let that slide, surprisingly enough. Still though, she remained unsatiated, and she turned her attention to the first flame which could be accessed in Drang Lake, at a point deep within the castle. At this point though, Vendrick realised her plans and took measures to defend the castle, then lock himself deep inside the undead crypt. As I'm sure we all know, the strongest female stereotype that is reinforced by patriarchy today is a woman who is submissive but pleasing to the eyes, unambitious besides the want of family, relatively uneducated and uninterested in the so-called man's world. We are making progress with breaking down these expectations, but their historical strength continues to affect us. But there have been other popular stereotypes throughout history. The one that Nashandra seems to be based off is the manipulative, scheming woman, the Lady Macbeth of the story. This stereotype is very clear in her characterization, as Nashandra pulled the strings and manipulated her king into providing her with more power. And although I like a lot of what is presented through her, I'll be the first to say that her actual character is relatively one-note. She wants power, and that seems to be her only motivator. It's her nature as a shard of Manus to want, and she doesn't defy or resist said nature. That is unfeminine, as we've gone over, but it's also worth mentioning that the game is not stating that women cannot resist some innate selfishness, that the manipulative Jezebel is the correct stereotype we should be applying, because Nashandra's sisters all defy their dark natures to some extent, and other female characters such as Lucatiel are, indeed, very nuanced. And also, Nashandra's version of the manipulative woman isn't the typical presentation. A stereotypical scheming woman does so typically not for the sake of personal ambition, but for the sake of a man she wants. A snake-eyed woman pulling strings and putting on a face is often in the same league as the more appreciated, dainty, and submissive woman, and that all they do is for men. So despite the one-note characterization of Nashandra, I appreciate the fact that her motivation was not male attention, as would be expected for her character were she a harmful stereotype. She schemed for herself, for her own selfish gain, like Lady Macbeth, who I'm sure was some level of inspiration. It's also worth noting that all the queens embody one aspect of Manus, so it does make sense that one main personality trait is explored with each queen. To finalise this section, I'd like to go over what is meant by the term dark nature, or child of the dark, as it's said in-game. I've seen some label the queens as evil, but that is not what is meant by the term darkness. Darkness is the natural state of humanity in Dark Souls. Despite the lies of Gwyn, fire is not our destiny. We all come from dark, but the queens do extremely directly, and are also not limited by the undead curse as our more diluted and entrapped human forms are. The game, then, is not saying that women are naturally or inherently evil, but they are capable of being villainous and being evil because they are capable of being human. Nashandra, like her sisters, had a choice to submit to her human selfishness, and she decided to. She shows that the ideas of femininity do not explain or apply to every woman, not through appearance nor through behavioural expectations, because beyond being female, people are human, and humanity cannot be boxed up neatly. Let's move on to another queen who thematically opposes Nashandra, Alsanna, queen of Ilium Lois, who is also the fan favourite. Does being critical of traditional femininity mean I believe it should be abolished? Do I, as some commenters have eloquently proposed, think that women should be men? Well, sure, people should be who they want to be, and I think Dark Souls with its non-binary catalogue would agree with me fully. But I also believe women are allowed to be feminine. They are allowed to fill traditional roles if it's undergone in a healthy way, and said woman is allowed to grow and step out of her box whenever she pleases. Alsanna embodies a lot of traditional aspects, but also steps outside the crushing categorization and shows herself to be powerful and having a will so strong she can defy her very nature. Unlike her sisters, Alsanna never shows her true form. To bring it back to feminine performance, as she was the one most accepted by her society and the one with the most investment in the society, I think it makes perfect sense that she never actually shows her true body. She has found a role and it suits her. Because she has found a place to call home, her true form and her current one have no real distinction. Because of the love and acceptance that she found in Ilium Lois, the feminine performance became less of a performance and more of an accepted state of being for her. I'd also like to add that despite filling this feminine role more accurately than her sisters, she is not physically appealing as her role would theoretically require. Maybe once, but now she is shriveled, emaciated skin and bone. Her robes hang off her, her hair has grown unkempt. As I mentioned earlier, women who fit the traditional mould are constantly expected to look good. It's one of their primary directives and something they should never discard. But this queen has decided that her duty is worth more than her looks. She is no self-absorbed trophy wife, no vain stereotype. She has discarded the expectation of beauty for the reality of duty. Alsanna is the embodiment of Manas's fear. Like her sisters, she ventured out to find a strong leader to ease her nature or reform the nation in her image, and the leader she found was the Ivory King. And instead of expecting a certain gendered performance, it suggested that he knew about her true nature and loved her regardless. You could argue that this depicts her as a woman in need of saving, and maybe that's true to a degree, but I'd say she had an equal part in becoming the woman she is when we meet her. Because she is the one who overcame her fear, the emotional core of her very being, with the help of the king, yes, but not solely due to his influence. So Alsanna does suit traditional feminine roles more cleanly than her sisters, but she isn't feeble and helpless, which is what patriarchy would expect of someone like her. In fact, she is equally as important as the Ivory King when it comes to containing the old chaos that lingers beneath their kingdom. The king himself ventured down to fight the chaos, but he failed to fully destroy it. In his wake, Alsanna seals it away with her magic, and thus the two of them together prevented the spread of demons. We see in-game that their defenses worked because chaos demons are almost entirely absent from Drangleic. In fact, the term demon seems to hold no relevance in Dark Souls 2, as the smelter demons who are not related to the chaos are labelled as such. Clearly, then, Alsanna holds a different strength to that of her sisters. Whilst they fight with unfeminine physicality, she uses magic from outside the battleground. But instead of this being a flimsy feminine attempt at combat, she does just as much as the Ivory King, and is just as dedicated to her kingdom. I think it's also worth noting that despite the fact both of the queens relate to some form of feminine stereotype, it's pushed beyond its limits, and thus the characters become something more nuanced. It would have been very easy to make Nashandra the scheming male-obsessed woman, or Alsanna the weak and tearful woman in need of rescue. But instead, they're placed alongside their male counterparts as equals, especially as the kings themselves do follow some kind of trope. Vendrick is strong but blinded by love, the Ivory King is the self-sacrificial heroic trope, and the Old Iron King is the one clouded by hubris. These characters are thusly explored and presented equally, regardless of gender. The queens aren't simply forgotten side characters that all fulfill the same caretaker role, they're all interesting in their own right, and allow for deep character exploration. They are all different because no two people are the same, regardless of any categories we fit them into. So with that, let's move on to the last two queens who will be covered together, as we don't know a huge amount about them, those two being Elana and Nadalia. Elana is the queen most similar in appearance to Nashandra. Both have feminine, humanoid aspects, but are still towering entities that appear almost elemental. Still, I think Elana has a more recognisable appearance, first and foremost because she retains a face. We've already covered the internalized aspects of femininity, so I won't rehash it, but I will add that I think the appearance of dresses on both Elana and Nashandra highlight the pervasive issue with women's clothing. As Suzanne Brownmiller discusses in her book Femininity, historically, women's clothing trends have always been constrictive, and this has been a talking point for feminists since the movement started, and we can observe it in this game too. Think of the great gown that made only shuffling possible, the corset which made you breathless and vulnerable, the high heel which requires you to walk in an entirely different way than is natural. When you really think about it, it seems absurd that women are expected to limit their movements in order to look more appealing. When I look at the dress-like bodies of the queens, I'm reminded of this idea because why would these two warrior women decide that they want to fight in dresses instead of something akin to armour, or even nothing at all? Of course, they didn't make that decision because, shocker, they're not real. I think we can apply the idea of internalization to these characters, but we also have to realise that these women were created mostly by men in a 2014 game. And also, gender is not one of the main themes as it is in Bloodborne. So, Yes, we can extrapolate a lot of interesting ideas from their presentation, but we also have to keep in mind that the game's external creation is pressured by patriarchal ideas. But back to Elana. As I mentioned, she has an actual face with an actual expression, not the skeletal one that Nashandra adorns. And I would say her expression is definitely not queenly by any stretch of the imagination. And maybe to some, it'll sound crazy that I'm even bringing expression into the concept of feminine performance, but just think about how often the phrase, "you should smile more," is used in media and real life. A woman who doesn't force a polite smile is accused of being rude, among other nice things. But Elana, in the state she is now, sees no need to hold such a smile. For the rest of her appearance, the same that I said about Nashandra can be applied to her, because the two of them are pretty similar. And because of the physical similarities, I find it compelling that their stories differ quite broadly. Nashandra had no real dedication to her kingdom, whilst Elana is now the sole occupant of hers, biding her time until she can seek justice against the Drakebloods. It comes back to these women being human above all, and differing in many ways despite historical expectations or frameworks. She's definitely one of those enemies I wish we could have talked to instead of immediately jumping, but I digress. Her lore is a little bit less clear than the previous queens, but like them, she found a king in Shulva and settled there. She is the shard that embodies wrath, and after the Drakebloods raided the city in search of the dragon's sin, she vowed to seek revenge and now lies gathering souls beside Sin. As far as I'm aware, there's no overt evidence that she had anything to do with the siege, but she was absent at the time. Of course, let me know if I'm missing something there. Whilst she does embody some aspects of the traditional caretaker role, as she appears to be looking after Sin by singing to him, she also embodies the more masculine guardian role, as she guards the dragon. I think that's an interesting flip on the fair maiden trapped in a tower and guarded by a dragon. And of course, being wrathful and living in a toxic, squalid wasteland isn't very feminine. So like the previous queens, there's traditional aspects in her characterization, but she's not limited to them. Her character goes far beyond the tight box of femininity, as she swings at you with a halberd as tall as your character. I hope I'm really driving this point home, because it's what I feel strongly about these women, that despite acknowledging tradition and stereotype, the game goes beyond that and shows them to be human and strong. They aren't objectified or weak, they are all different and compelling in their own ways, and they're allowed to be more than a warrior woman in revealing armour, or a weak but desperately attractive queen. Now let's move on to Nadalia to finish this video off. First off, I really like her design, and I think it's pretty underrated. She is femininity deconstructed, a burning pillar in the vague shape of a woman. Her image plagues the entirety of the Broom Tower. This is her domain, and she lets you know that very obviously. But beyond that, she is a mess of hands and flame. She's quite literally a monster, the antithesis of dainty and small femininity, and I love that. A burning pyre of a woman reflects the imagery of witch hunt, but for Nadalia, it's been flipped as a sign of power, not persecution. Lore-wise, she ventured to find the Iron King, but discovered his realm destroyed and abandoned. In her grief, she split her soul into the idols and covered the tower in a thick smog, then resurrected the soldiers to protect her and, I suppose, comfort her. Her actions seemed to be born of desperation, like she was trying to take up the mantle of leader and bring back this great, bustling kingdom, like she was trying to reject the reality that she was too late to find her king. Her reaction to this depressing reality is not submission and tears as would be anticipated, but fiery rejection. And I think her tale is maybe the most tragic as well, seeing as she represents Manas's loneliness, and instead of finding comfort like Alsanna did through people, she was instead met by a tower just as lonely and abandoned as her. Nadalia is also the only queen where the concept of motherhood is directly involved. Rame, or Fume Knight, found her lair and found her, and she became a mother figure to him who swore to become her guardian. Because, whilst it's absent from the other queens' stories, motherhood is something a lot of women strive for, and it can be a wonderful thing. In this case, I certainly would say it was, because the lonely queen and outcast knight were able to find comfort in one another, two people removed from the world. This does mean she embodies some traditional qualities, including having a man guarding her, but as we've already discussed, she is strong in her own right and brought equal meaning to Rame's life, as he did hers. Nadalia's item descriptions are also how we learn these queens hold inconceivable power. We already see their strength, but having it confirmed in descriptions drives home the fact that these women do hold power, more power than their kings even. Yes, they embody some feminine traits and roles, but they break the biggest rule of all, that women should not have power. Because, as this game clearly states, women are capable of strength, mental and physical, the indomitable human spirits, the Olympic champion, the violent heart of humanity. Women have access to all of it because they have access to humanity. I do find a lot of categorization and harmful stereotyping always comes down to dehumanization, trying to separate a certain group from the humanity we all share. But thankfully, Dark Souls does not fall into this trap because it is a brilliant series with a lot to say. There's also something to be said about the fact that the queens are pure forms of darkness, and that humanity's true state of being is darkness in the world of Dark Souls. These women, more so than their kings or anyone else in the game, represent a truer form of humanity, one that lives within the natural bounds not contained by the Age of Fire. As the Wrathful Axe states, when the abyss dissipated, the things that called it home were fragmented and scattered across the realm. Eventually, these pieces regained form in ways that hinted at humanity's true nature. The natural state of humanity does not subjugate women or treat them as prizes. It instead appreciates the power they hold, the equal companionship they can offer, and the terrible things they can commit, the violence they can exercise. It appreciates them first and foremost as fellow humans. And thus, I feel the fact all 4 queens went to seek powerful companions says more about humanity than it does women. The fact that said companions were men is due to the patriarchal system of Dark Souls. We are social creatures, and we are creatures that appreciate power. For some, it brings comfort and warmth, protection from fear, and for others it is a seductive and irresistible force. But for everyone, companionship is a part of life. The queen searching for strong companions and inviting kingdoms is something we all do in our daily lives. The queens, then, are interesting depictions of women, and a lot can be drawn about what femininity means to them. They are an interesting painting of humanity itself. Thank you everyone for watching. I absolutely banged out this script and I really like what it ended up as, so I hope you got something out of it as well. I've got exams to focus on at the moment, but lots of videos are in the works which I'm hoping to work on after May. So as usual, if you want to be a part of the community, remember to subscribe, join the Discord, check out the Twitch, and support me on Kofi if you'd like. Thank you again, and goodbye.